Okay, hello, dear viewers. Welcome to the ninth virtual seminar on applied economics and policy analysis in Central Asia. I'm your moderator, Babu, based at Westminster International University, Tashkent. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on Wednesday. Today, we're very privileged to have Dr. Suresh Babu with us to discuss his paper on agriculture's contribution to structural transformation lessons for Central Asian countries. So Dr. Babu is no stranger to the region. He is one of the pioneers to start research on the region in his capacity as the first coordinator for Central Asia program at the International Food Policy Research Institute. So he's been engaged with the region and its staff and its citizens for the last 25 years. So we're very grateful to have him back virtually at the very least today. So Dr. Babu was educated at Iowa State University. In Iowa, he worked at Cornell. He advised many governments in Africa and Southeast Asia. He's currently a senior research fellow and head of capacity strengthening at IFPRI. So thank you, Dr. Babu, to join us today. To discuss briefly his comments after the presentation is Dr. Nader Janibekov, who's a research fellow at IAMO. I'm sure most of you know him well from his last presentation on Wednesday. So without any further introduction, Dr. Babu, over to you. I would just like, before we start, to remind our viewers that you can address your questions in the section Q&A to our panelists and key speakers during their speech and discussion. So thank you again, and over to you, Dr. Babu.
Thank you, Bakram. It's been a pleasure working with you for quite a number of years. And I also want to start with my colleague, Kamiljan Akramov, who was leading our Central Asia, Russia regional program for IFPRI, and he has been instrumental in bringing colleagues from IFPRI to the Central Asia region, working on various types of issues that we want to address collectively in the region. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me as a presenter in this excellent program, a very excellent lineup of issues and topics that have been identified. So I just want to, at the outset, express my gratitude, not only for inviting me, but also for this whole program that benefits going beyond the people who are involved in it. With that, let me kind of quickly give a background information about this work, and then maybe a kind of introduction to the presentation as well. For quite some time, in the context of at least South Asian countries, which is another region that IFPRI works, we have been wondering about what has been happening in terms of this transformation, economic transformation in general, and how does this agriculture, as part of that structural transformation, been changing and contributing along with this process. There has been quite interest, not just in South Asia, but also in developing world. And IFPRI, to some extent, has taken leadership in this type of research. And particularly the department where Kamiljan is working, they have been looking at the structural change in many countries. And there is a recent book, if someone is interested in, IFPRI has produced a recent book on that. So I just wanted to give that introduction to you. And then move on. That is the kind of motivation for us to look at seriously. It's what's happening in India in this context. But in this presentation, I'll give you a little bit of theory as well as to motivate the background, and then move into the applied part of it so that you can appreciate the process of conducting the research itself. So in that context, we all think about economic transformation as a process where we work towards improving the economy, and in that process reduce poverty and improve the welfare of the people. And that's a broader set of goals that we work through. If you look at China as an example, the economic transformation has been, established, documented very well. What the policies that underline the economic transformation process. But as part of that, agriculture also transforms as a sector, and that transformation has to be understood from a sectoral perspective, because we often argue about what is the contribution of agriculture to economic transformation. What is the contribution of agriculture towards poverty reduction, for example? And that brings the question of how does the productivity changes or the improvements and growth in one sector and the relative contribution of various sectors in an economy affects the economic transformation itself in a larger sense. So that is, from that perspective, you want to focus on one sector and understand how that sector is contributing. And on the other hand, how that relatively changes the structural change in the economic structure, and then that contributes to transformation, economic transformation as well. So this has large implications. For example, we want to ask the question about why do we study that? Why do we need to understand these issues? The simple answer would be we need to understand because we want to find out what works, what doesn't work. What are the factors that are contributing this structural transformation, and where is the stagnation comes from, for example, and what factors that could be useful in terms of policy and institutional interventions, so to some extent governance intervention, for example, that can stimulate the process of the structural transformation to go forward. So that could be a motivation in some sense, but also to focus on a particular sector like agriculture, for example. Do we invest in agriculture research? Do we invest in, for example, to increase productivity growth? Or do we invest in human capital, for example, because the human capital quality can be low? And or do we invest in connecting the research to policy, farmers on the one, by institutional strengthening, such as extension? Is that the gap that we are facing? So on the one hand, we are looking at the opportunities for investing in a particular sector to see how that sector is contributing the overall economic transformation, but also look at what are the intersectoral linkages that we need to be thinking about. What is happening broadly? So let me, with that kind of broad set of motivation to understand, and all these have policy implications. For example, if you are advising the prime minister or president of a country, and the policymakers are asking you, what should we be thinking about in the next 5 to 10 years? And the information about this structural change and what contributes to the growth in various sectors and how intersectoral growth contributes to overall economic transformation become serious questions for strategic kind of intervention. So that's a starting point, that's a motivation, and in this literature particularly, and it has been going on for a long time. Let me kind of move to that, quickly show quick set of literature in the background and the origin of this, and then we can talk about it. In fact, I talked a little bit about what is structural transformation and what is a motivation. Basically, we are talking about reallocation of economic activity across the broad sectors, right? And in a common economy, we have 3 broad sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And where is our comparative advantage lies at any point in time for a particular country, and how that really has implications for where we put our resources. Some countries may neglect agriculture and then say, hey, we have oil, for example, right? And let's work on the oil, and then only to come back to find out that, wow, that's not a good strategy. But we didn't really do much with the oil in terms of, or any natural resource, for example, in terms of solving problems in rural areas, okay? And we can give examples after examples. And of course, in development economics, we study about the Dutch disease, for example, right? And Nigeria is a classic case where I work, I continue to work now. And they will talk about that later in detail. But then you find out the wrong type of allocation of resources for different economic activities can lead to stagnation of economic growth and stagnation of poverty reduction. And people can remain poverty for a long time if you make wrong wrong decisions on allocation of resources. That's particularly one way to look at that in terms of allocation of resources to economic activities in broad sectors. And as a consequence of structural transformation, for example, we look at share of output and employment because it systematically varies with the development across countries. And various stages of development is very important to understand when you advise the governments on policies and strategies. Where is the stage of development and what contributes to that stage of development? And looking at Central Asia, for example, as an anecdotal thing, you can look at in the past 20 years after the post-Soviet era, there is tremendous amount of changes that has been happening. How do we trace them is a good place to start, for example. Okay, why reallocation takes place? And there is, this literature goes back to 1930s and 1940s. I just want to quickly raise this literature for people to follow up and then dig deeper. You can just Google them and read it yourself. Particularly given the students are a majority of this audience here, I just want to show some background so that you can quickly trace this literature and catch up on it. So the literature starts with Clark, 1940-51, change in this demand structure, how structural change happens in the demand as economic growth happens. But then that is also followed up by the Baumol literature in the 60s on the differential productivity growth. Different sectors grow differentially, and because of that, we need to be thinking about how do we manage this sectoral growth. But then there is a lot of intersectoral linkages, and that brings us to understand about what kind of factors move from one sector to another, and whether it is in a way that we would like them to happen, right? That's a policy kind of question that you want to ask in the long run. And also the related issue is this inter-industry division of labor, which we'll talk about in detail as we go along. And that is a kind of starting point for this literature. And then you see that in the 50s, these models are formalized. And one example of this model is the Arthur Lewis model in 1954, what we call two-sector model. In his work on economic development with unlimited supplies of labor. It's a fundamental reading for all of us in economic development. We have read that several times. And that basically posits that there is dual economy. One is the subsistence agriculture, where you have casual labor, which is of low productivity because of the low education level, and basically involved in primary agriculture production activities, and then few other kind of additional labor there may be involved in petty trade and other non-farm activities, which may be very small even in rural sector. But then there is also a capitalistic kind of sector, which is basically manufacturing. In those days they were not thinking hugely about this service sector, but that's the reason why you see this two-sector model at that time. So, and that has a different characteristic, right? And that has a slightly higher wage to talk about. And also it has the productivity of the labor is slightly higher, depending on the educational level. And that is considered to be a little bit more productive in terms of using the labor and in terms of output as well, manufacturing sector. But then in less developed economies, the characteristic of a less developed economy, if even in most of sub-Saharan Africa where I work, there is labor supply is unlimited in the agriculture sector. There's huge amount of labor, and then they are all available in subsistence wage. You can actually hire them for the same wage, irrespective of number of laborers available there, right? So that's basically enormous amount of but then low level of wages, basic wages. So marginal productivity of labor in that kind of subsistence sector is very negligible, and in fact we can even say zero. So that's a characteristic of the economy that we are working with sometimes, and that is a model that now we say, hey, I could think about that, but that's about 60-70 years later, right? We could have thought about Arthur Lewis's model, but at that time when Arthur Lewis thought about it, it was not formalized as a model. Okay, It existed, this condition existed, but he put an economic framework behind that thought process, and of course he won a Nobel Prize later on with Theodor Schultz, as you can remember, on this economic model. Okay, so that's a kind of understanding. That's where we come from. I mean, from the starting point of what is a primitive or basic economy will look like when it is trying to develop towards modern economy, for example, right? Moving on. But of course, Lewisian perspective says that so labor shall be transferred from one subsistence, from the subsistence to the capitalistic sector without agricultural output. That's one of the outcomes of the theory, particularly. Okay, so you have surplus labor. What do you do with it? So if you invest in a capitalistic kind of a manufacturing sector, you can actually shift this labor towards that and make them more productive, right? So, but for quite some time, it will not affect agricultural productivity or output, particularly because there is huge amount of labor that is sitting there. Okay, employment expands in capitalistic sector because of that kind of shift. If you pursue that kind of line of thought, and also as capital formation occurs in that sector. Okay, so people invest in manufacturing, but requires labor to come in from agriculture, so that shift happens. Okay, that's possible actually in the early stages of then. Wages don't rise until surplus labor really exhausts. So that wage level remains the same in agriculture until a stage where labor becomes tight. Now, India is a good case right now. In rural areas, we don't have labor. The wage rate is increasing for even casual labor, right? So that's something that we observe also. It's not anything new for us. And particularly in the capitalistic sector, where you get this profit and that profit is reinvested, and through tax policies and financing policies, you get that sector going with this additional coming in, the labor coming from sector. So once the subsistence sector has no more surplus labor, the wage tends to rise there as well, contributing to the economic welfare of these people who are remaining in agriculture as well. So that's the poverty reduction effect that takes place much later in those economies. So when the economies are open, for example, there is also possibility of migration from surrounding countries that check the wage rate, in low, sometimes in agriculture, and that's something sometimes you see from even in Central Asia. I mean, moving from one country to another for working. There's also another thing, another issue to keep in mind. For example, in the context of India, we see that because India is like almost 20-25 small countries put together, right? Each state has its own borders and so on. You see the labor migration, equalizing wage throughout India, quickly because of the infrastructure we have for transportation and so on. That's something that we can talk about. Okay, so that's the kind of Lewisian perspective that we always start with, and I want to quickly go. And that model was built further upon others who came in. I don't want to get into the theory of it, but I want to give a flavor, and I want the students to just get a flavor of it so that they can start. It's all in economics development books. I will quickly get into India model, but I want to give this Gustav Ranis and John Fee theory of economic development. It's a classical paper that you probably should want to read if you are moving in that direction. Okay, don't miss that paper. It's a classical paper and very readable paper, so to speak, for even an entry-level person. And they elaborate on Arthur Lewis's model and his framework, and considers technological progress in agriculture. That is the time, if you remember, particularly European, US kind of economies have introduced hybrid corn, and that created a agricultural productivity growth. And then they kind of incorporated that. What happens if technological progress happens in agriculture? And they also divide the labor transfer process into two. One, labor with zero marginal productivity. What happens to those people? And also the disguised employed people. There are people in agriculture, but they may not be in agriculture, right? Even now it happens. If you do the census, agriculture census, people will say, yeah, I'm in rural area, I'm working on agriculture, but they may not contribute to anything, right? That kind of labor force is also there. What happens to that labor force? They kind of differentiated those labor force transfer. Okay, that's Ranis and Few's elaboration of Lewis's model. And they also came up with the 3 phases of this transfer that is happening. For example, phase 1, laborers with 0 marginal productivity or very negligible marginal productivity shall be transferred to capitalistic sector with no impact on output on wages. Okay, so you are not going to destroy agriculture by moving from agriculture. That's the phase 1. As long as we saw that phase 1 also in Lewis's model, for example. Then in phase 2, these are the laborers who move, the disguised unemployed employed people also can be transferred to capitalists. In fact, these people can be trained quickly if they have some education, mainly because they don't want to go into agriculture because they are a little bit more educated. So they don't want to go and milk the cow, right? These guys, particularly youth right now, we are talking about youth employment in agriculture in all these countries right now. And this is the kind of group we are talking about. Although it was thought about 60, 70 years ago, but even now this group exists in rural areas. And I'm sure in Central Asia also there are some that we can tap. So that can be transferred with skills and entrepreneur skills and into a capitalistic. And then comes the takeoff process. And phase, and Rustow talks about it. And phase 3, end of this takeoff process, no more labor available to transfer from agriculture. And then agriculture wages start to rise. And we talked about that in a minute. So that is where, when labor shortage is in agriculture, you see this induced innovation in agriculture, right? Hayami and Rattan kind of model kicks in there. And then commercialization starts. What can we do when there is no labor in agriculture? Can we come up with machines to start with? Innovation comes in. Agriculture research investment comes in. And so that kind of increases commercialization of agriculture. And now we are talking about value chains in the modern kind of language. We are looking at the value chains absorbing labor and mechanization. Moving on. Let me slowly go. Okay, so then there comes this 3-sector model, where you have this introduction of services sector, right? Tertiary sector, which has become very standard now. And in fact, most of the economies are driven by services sector, right? If particularly where there is not much of agriculture going, or there is no possibility of agriculture, and industry is not flourishing, then you move into tertiary sector. Some of the economies like Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, there's very high level of tertiary sector, right? So that introduction of that becomes another dimension in the literature. I've given some literature, and since this is going to be available to you, you can take a look at that from that perspective, where it started the thinking of the tertiary sector, right? So now the modern structural structural transformation literature looks at these 3 sectors: agriculture, industries, service sectors. Workers move from agriculture industries to industries in stage 1. They move from agriculture to industries to service in stage 2, right? Some people move on to service directly to agriculture from service. And the drivers in the literature are primarily the change in the demand. Okay, what is demanded in the society? As income increases, as you know, the demand for manufacturing increases, demand for services increases. Also, the specialization comes in even within the service sector, right? And of course, it's also driven by the productivity differentials between the sectors. In which sector productivity is more? And that has implications for the topic today we are talking about, the structural transformation, because that's something that we are moving into studying, right? So we talked about inter-industry division of labor. That is again determined by where is where can I, for an individual with certain amount of education, the question is, where can I make more money, right? Which sector can I enter in? So that is the decision laborers make, and that decides the labor flow, and that decides the economic structure. So in simple terms, right? We'll come back to that. Okay, let me show some evidence. What has been happening in different countries? Like I mentioned, we'll basically look at the output trend and employment trend. Okay, the pattern of what is happening in output and employment as simple indicators of the trend in the structural change kind of literature. And you have this 3 sectors The blue color, if you can see the color lines, the blue color is agriculture. The red or maroon color is industries, and the green color is services. And if you take USA and UK as an example of advanced economies to start with, one in Europe and one in North America, and you are seeing a pattern that can be, justified, right? For example, output and employment, you can see the move together in different sectors. Service sector grows faster than any other sector in the last 50, 60 years. And particularly if you look at the USA and UK, you can see this service sector led growth is faster, little bit faster in USA than UK. And to some extent, you can see that service sector driven economic transformation in the advanced countries in the last 50 years. You can quickly see that getting the agriculture down and industries also going down, service sector is taking off. And this pattern of growth, the pattern of structural transformation, structural change, is still being debated. Is it good for developing countries? In some countries, we debate about, can we skip the industrialization altogether? Because it's not going to be possible to compete in industries. Why don't we just get to the service sector? That has implication for advice that we give to the countries, right? In the structural adjustment literature, if you look at in the 90s, a whole lot of papers talked about, in Africa particularly, and we can talk about Central Asia as well. I would like Nodir to come and guide us on that. The thought process in the 90s, early 90s was, when I was seriously starting to work in Africa, these countries are not going anywhere in industries. Agriculture is not going to really contribute either. So let's think about, service sector. But then quickly within 10 years, we turn around and say, wow, without agriculture, there is no growth in Africa. I mean, that's a huge lesson within 10 years. And that's when, particularly at IFPRI, we started working on the growth linkages program. In IFPRI's growth linkages activities research really pushed that kind of thought process. Without agriculture, you cannot develop the other sectors, because the growth linkages, forward and backward linkages in agriculture is very huge. And by farmers producing and selling and then demanding non-agricultural products, is 1:3 kind of ratio, right? $1 you earn in agriculture is actually generating $3, for example, in some economies in non-agricultural sector. So that means poverty reduction efforts, employment effects are very, very huge. But again, for example, we are looking at, for understanding the pattern, okay, for UK and USA. We'll come to the discussions on developing country context in a minute. And then moving on, we compare China. Always in India, we compare China and India. It is kind of a large economies, a huge amount of labor force, different types of policies, at the same time, differential growth patterns, okay? And in Indian policymakers always raise the question, what is China doing differently? How can we replicate China's effort, for example? But at the same time, there are structural constraints that we will not be able to replicate China fully because of that's in itself is a huge comparative research going on at IFPRI, for many years now. We have a book, if someone is interested, we have a book on elephants and the dragons. Dragons being China and elephant being India, for example, looking at the economic growth pattern. But what we here also, we see some similar pattern among these huge economies, right? But then there is differences also. Output transforms in similar fashion. I mean, that's well known in the economic transformation literature. But if you look at China, the manufacturing dominates in terms of transformation, right? You can see that clearly. Real output growth in manufacturing dominating compared to particularly India, for example, in output terms. We do have employment concerns in India. Why? Because agriculture goes down very fast, but the employment in agriculture is not going down. You see that right-hand top graph, that the employment is not going down. That's a concern, and it's also a myth. it's a mystery. It's also a problem for economists to solve. So it becomes a interesting problem to look at why, when the pattern is supposed to be like that Indian employment in agriculture is not going down. Then we ask the question, in fact, that leads us to this motivation of the paper that I will be presenting quickly. Is it because of we are not accounting for disguised employment that we talked about, right, before? If everyone says I'm in agriculture, we truly believe that they are actually digging the soil and planting the crop and harvesting the crop, right? And how do we define the labor in agriculture? What is the data that we have on agricultural labor force? Is data deceiving us, or the theory deceiving us, or actually the transformation of the economy is fundamentally different? So that's the motivation behind our work that we are looking at. But that's something I want to give this kind of historical figures for motivating the thought process. I mean, imagine Uzbekistan in this case, for example. What would the graph look like for Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan? It's an interesting thing to do. I tried to look at some data, but I was not very comfortable with the data so far. So maybe we can talk about that. Anyway, so this is the motivation for Central Asia to look at what is happening in the Central Asian countries, which is fundamental for economic policy advising. If you are an advisor to the president or even a sectoral ministry, you need to understand this pattern of change and how confident you are to see what is a pattern in terms of output and employment. It's a basic kind of analysis, but it's a very powerful kind of thinking. So let me also compare two other broad categories of and Brazilian. These are all emerging economies, as you know. I mean, Brazil is a huge emerging economy, and if you see the output pattern in the last in Brazil, there is not clear pattern. But of course, Brazil is not doing very well overall, but then it's also been progressing, right? But you see the employment as shown in agriculture has come down drastically, right? But how does this look? It's a inverse of what we saw in India, right? And how do we explain this? So I'm talking to some of the Brazilian economists on this and so on. So there is not quite a bit of unique relation there. And rise in agriculture, for example, Nigeria we talked about as a classic example of Dutch disease. Rise of agriculture in the 1980s in Nigeria, right? And the stagnant service sector employment particularly. So Nigeria is still struggling and now coming to its terms with agriculture. Now we can't rely on oil because the oil is simply the raw material that is taken out of the country. And in fact, even the gasoline that is used in Nigeria is coming back is imported. They sell the raw oil outside, crude oil outside, and then get the gasoline, refined gasoline for the rows imported. So so they are realizing the importance of agriculture now, starting to invest in agriculture, right? So that's a good example of how distorted policies or distorted priorities, distorted economic allocation can actually keep you down in stagnation. Okay, now coming to this topic about how the structural transformation contributes to growth, that's something that we want to take on from that, right? So so far we put that broad theory, broad pattern out there, and how does this work? Contribution of structural change has been analyzed by several authors, leading authors continue to be analyzed, including IFPRI authors. Jorgens and Timmer, for example, 2011 paper, it shows the contribution of structural change to growth is practically zero in United States example. European is less than 5%, Japan is less than 6%, for example, but almost one quarter of structural change, growth in India can be attributed to structural change. And in Tanzania, the latest result is about 80%. What does it tell us, in broad terms? Quick inference is that for the students to think about, as a country is in a different development stage, the contribution of structural change is going to be different for growth, right? That's a quick observation. And particularly India and Tanzania gives a drastic picture there. And that's something that we can explore further. What is the stage in which the economy is? That is going to be helpful in terms of understanding this pattern. Let me move. So agriculture contribution particularly we want to study because most of the countries that we deal with in terms of economic policy advice, at least from IFPRI point of view, they are agrarian, so to speak, economies. And they have a lot of things going in agriculture sector. And we need to worry about what is agriculture contribution to the economic transformation and agriculture, how it itself changes in its productivity, so we can trace that transformation process. So on the supply side, we are thinking about higher research and development, so better technology comes in and reduces the productivity of labor. For example, when productivity of labor increases, the cost of production goes down, and that has implication for how agriculture contributes to overall economic growth. And in that process, we also create surplus labor in agriculture. For example, mechanization comes in, it can do things better than a lot of labor. So you have surplus labor which can be released to going back to the Arthur Lewis model, which can be released to non-farm or non-farm industries or manufacturing, for example. Mechanizing farm operations generate further surplus labor. Of course, relative rise in public and private investment sustain this productivity improvement. So agriculture itself has a homework to do in order to find out where is the growth comes from, where is the productivity can come from, how can we release the labor so that more labor can be released for industry and service sector, for example. On the demand side of it, of course, agriculture terms of trade falls, right, with higher food production. As the productivity increases, the terms of trade falls. But this also raises the demand for non-agriculture commodities. This is a growth linkage literature I talked about that IFPRI pioneered in 80s and 90s. When people were not believing in agriculture, we in fact showed that agriculture productivity growth in agriculture can actually raise demand for non-food commodities, which can stimulate growth through forward and backward linkages, right? So that's a contribution, a broad set of contributions. We can go on talking about it, but I want to give that introduction where agriculture comes in this whole process of economic transformation. Okay. Now I'm jumping
Suresh,
with that.
we have 5 minutes left.
Oh my goodness, that's good actually, because I want to give the case of India as an exercise for students to read, because a very thorough discussion paper has been shared. It goes through the methodology completely. It also looks at the literature, and it raises the case of India in a way that it can be replicated by any student for any other country. And if I at the outset, I want to say that if any student listening to it want to send me an email and want to talk about it, it doesn't matter where you are, Australia, US, or Europe, we can start the conversation, because Westminster and IFPRI, these colleagues provide just a platform for us to come together. So we can particularly talk about in the context of Central Asia, because that's something that I'm particularly interested in with Dr. Kamil John. So dynamic composition, India, as I showed this graph before, it is atypical transformation. So it is a puzzle for us. So I'm going to quick movely. It deviates from the developed countries transformation. It clearly shows the shift towards services, but bypassing largely the role of manufacturing. Stagnant manufacturing for a long time, and agriculture still remains a huge labor force, right? And this is where this uncorrelating employment output comes in. I give you some details here. Recently, though, the employment in agriculture has been going down, right? So that is also another puzzle. Okay, why is this quickly turnaround? Is it because of reforms, or is it because of other contributions in the economy, right? So that's the question that we are raising. So it's another motivating factor there. So just for our analytical sense, so we take this national productivity growth and subdivide that into the two types of contributions, right? One within the productivity improvement, within the sector, within agriculture, how that productivity changes, and then intersectoral labor shift as a contribution. Okay, so that can be studied with respect to agriculture, industry, and services, which we do, each one of them in our paper. It is called a decomposition approach, which we take in our paper. There is also econometric approach people have taken. The other approach is a CGE modeling type of approach people have taken, but we use a decomposition approach just for the methodological sake. So we show these numbers, right, in terms of percentages of this particular decomposition. Where does this national growth come from in terms of structural change happening in agriculture, whether it is within the productivity, within the sector productivity changes, or because the intersectoral changes, right? And how does that contribute to national productivity? But where does that come from? Agriculture, industry, and services. And the same graph that you show components of growth are in numbers in the paper here. Okay, and we do that in 3 time period. In the Indian case, if you look at 82 to 93. The first phase was very stagnant kind of agriculture, right? Where the labor is very surplus. But then 94 to 2004 is the post-reform period. People said, hey, we open it up and foreign investment comes. That means more manufacturing, absorbs more labor from agriculture. But it's still, we were not very sure why the labor employment is not going down in agriculture. That was a puzzle period. But then in the last 10 years, 15 years, we are seeing the normal trend towards transformation. Just look at these numbers in the paper and you will understand this transformation, what is happening. So we ask the question, where do this labor really move from rural areas to where do they go? And we know in the larger sense now, through our analysis, this graph shows that it's now starting to go down in agriculture, and they move to, majority of them move to construction sector. And in India, this construction is booming everywhere because this urbanization is happening, and most of the unskilled agricultural laborers are quickly moving into a construction sector in the urban and semi-urban areas. That is creating huge demand for agricultural labor in the rural areas. Okay, that's a simple kind of clear-cut example in the last 15 years. What is labor move doing to agriculture? Okay, and also productivity growth of labor in general. And as a policy, see, you can also address the policy dimension of labor policies. For example, I want to give an example that we use in the policy in the paper, Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which actually ensures 100 days of labor for rural people if they are staying in rural areas. For example, there are people who cannot move out of their villages. So, and this program actually, it's a safety net program where it gives guarantee of employment. But that really has not had any big impact on the labor movement, because labor going outside agriculture earns a lot more, and the poverty reduction efforts are very high. And these details are in the paper if you want to look at. But then a larger result is the shift in the labor is also due to, within the sector shift, okay? They also due to high value commodities. And that's something is relevant for Central Asian countries. As they think about transforming their economies, agricultural economies towards high value export oriented commodities, there is going to be huge shift from cereal production or cotton production, so to speak, right, to high value commodities. That requires a lot more in terms of value chain contribution, processing sector, export sector, food safety sector, and so on. These laborers have to be brought in from the agriculture sector, which was kind of, so to speak, the disguised employment that we always saw. So that's what we see in agriculture is also happening in India, and we show that in the paper. That's a third kind of result in the paper. And again, this may be not that much of an interest, but I want to show that various states, I said it's about 20 to 25 states within India, we study state level pattern of development, okay? And it is, think about comparing Central Asian and Caucasian countries, small countries, how do they have the pattern, So studying each country and comparing the pattern. So this is what we are saying. There are some countries which have both output growth in terms of the subsectors, livestock and crops. Some grow only in livestock, some grow only in crops, and that relates to intersectoral movement of labor, right? So that's something that you can study about. Again, we are studying the productivity, land productivity convergence among the sectors. That's another result that we are showing up. And this shows us which states have to be invested, should invest more in land productivity, where the research and investment is, research and development investment is important. That is the derived kind of result from the structural change studies, as an example. Of course, capital formation, we can study who comes in, private sector versus public sector. And that is also another interesting investment pattern that we need to study. And mechanization and inclusion. Is the transformation inclusive process? And what type of mechanization is happening? Whether it is pro-poor or very smallholder sector oriented, and how can we study that? The results are in the paper. I'm just giving a motivation to think about it. But then coming to Central Asian, and we have been looking at the literature, it is kind of limited and rather a new area for you. But we can start thinking about, because this kind of analysis requires a good amount of data, detailed amount of data, and that is often either not available or it's not reliable. So I think that is one of the reasons why this kind of studies have not taken off in Central Asia. But then as a collectively, Westminster and Nordis team and IFPRI, maybe we can start thinking about with graduate students to invest in more of this data collection and harmonization, and maybe bring in additional players, who want to invest in this kind of data set for long-term development thinking and development planning. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Suresh, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. So over to your discussant, hopefully, please brief. So we want to open up for the audience as well at the end.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Suresh Babu. I will follow up with my own slides. How can I start this screen share? Oh, okay, here. Let's see. Okay, is it visible, Bahram? Super. Yes. So, going to the points that you mentioned, Dr. Babu, I think it's quite relevant for what our Central Asian, post-Soviet Central Asian countries has been experiencing in terms of this transformation, structural change and reallocation of labor resources. So the point of your paper, which is to look at how the role of productivity growth and structural change in agriculture in overall economic growth, I think it's quite relevant, and I'm very much appreciate that you pointed at the importance of using official statistical data, and in your case, it's at the province level, at the states level, and over, 35 years, So that's kind of interesting approach, can be also quite relevant for Central Asian countries, which recently the agriculture has been changing its face, since 1991, from Soviet agriculture dominated by large collective farms and followed by unprecedented reforms like land reforms, new types of producing being introduced, private investors, and completely different also requirements for labor force, but at the same time also other sectors catching up, in urban areas. So here we see what you pointed, that there is this positive relations between laborship and agricultural output, and how they're basically contributing to the growth in other sectors,
Yep.
And that there is no that this kind of shift of labor also didn't imply any decline in agriculture. So that was kind of other sectors absorbing agricultural workforce would also didn't have any implications for agricultural sector. So with this, I would like also to complement this discussion with the data which you mentioned, that you already look at this, you probably also look at ILO data on labor or World Development Indicators. So for instance, what we know from Central Asian experiences from 1991 to recent, what is available 2019, from World Development Indicators based on ILO estimates, this how the labor allocation goes across these three sectors which you mentioned, agriculture, industry, and services. We see something like also this kind of heterogeneous patterns in Central Asia. For some cases, you see that the service sector has taken over, through the last 27, 28 years, like in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, service sector is the green one. The green line is major workplace for labor. Also in Uzbekistan, but still in Tajikistan, for instance, quite significant share in agriculture still. So there I put in opposite to what you said, also this rigid process of labor movement from agriculture, that it still composes very large place for employment in economy. What we see also in Central Asian case, to complement what you have been telling on your studies on other parts of the world, like in African continent or in India, directly in this presentation, we also see that there is this labor and land productivity going up in Central Asian countries. This U-shaped against this 1991 values. There is, after a certain period of time, the agricultural productivity for both for land and labor has been going up. And in terms of what you said, this kind of strange patterns that you didn't probably like, so that probably could be related to this value added of 3 sectors as percentage of in GDP. Here we see that, there was this, in some cases, the service sector bypassed agriculture, like in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan went quite, its dominance and contributions to GDP, but does it mean that it's right now it's service-led economy? For small economies like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, could be, but for Kazakhstan, which is very much what you mentioned also, oil exporting country, resource exporting countries, what it means is service-led economy. And what we know from Central Asian cases, there is very strong share of urban areas in GDP, like especially in service sector. So service sectors are mostly located in cities, large cities, like in Tashkent, for instance, or Almaty in Kazakhstan. So that also would imply how the gains or growth is distributed across space. And finally, coming to the comments which I wanted to also to raise following your presentation, that's in fact this kind of study is quite data intensive, and for Central Asian countries, one interesting component could be to look at across countries. This cross-country comparison would be interesting, as we know that there is this different manner approach has been taken for economic development. The role of government in certain countries until recently there were strong influence of the government in controlling, for instance, land use, like under cotton or wheat production. So there is also, or like in terms of data quality, would be also currency control. We have official exchange rate deflated, and then also parallel black market exchange rate, how to use this into the data set, and also this employment number, as you correctly mentioned, that's a big concern, how these employments are actually recorded. For instance, is the household, the small scale household farms, are they considered employed as the employment places primarily is agriculture, or is it also considers other sectors? Then also again this comment on the concentration of the service sector in major cities, that could be an issue in Central Asian countries, where you will see that large capitals, they're contributing quite share in value in service sector production. And also this surplus labor, I don't know, I'm not that much familiar with this study area which you based your presentation, like India, where I think also in urban areas, in certain urban areas in Central Asia, there is already surplus of labor. So there is high unemployment in towns, which could be considered. And then also this problem of development of slums, what it means is urban migration, what it will imply to the public infrastructure. and also this, yeah, you also mentioned this, but this, that urban sectors can expand also through increasing capital, yeah, rather than in labor. So it's capital-led intensive growth rather than requiring labor, yeah. So they could bypass this demand for low productive agricultural workers. Yeah, and then, but you already mentioned this. I followed your slides previously. I didn't see this quite specifically, this characteristics, this public employment guarantee programs that you mentioned. That's quite also interesting. What is their role, yeah, in this kind of transformation process or shifting labor from rural areas to other sectors? Okay, thank you. That was my discussion part. And
okay, thank you very much, Dr. Janibekov. Suresh, so I'll read, there are questions and I have my questions, but I'll read two questions in short, briefly, and then you can answer and comment on all of the questions and concern from your discussant and the audience. Is that okay? We're running over time, so but I think it's okay. Audience will allow me to go over 5 minutes today. So the first one is, you spoke about the 70s and 80s in Africa and its transformation you went through and the role of agriculture for development. So, and the question was, how is it okay to compare agriculture from the 70s and now because of the technological improvements in the sector? And whether so agriculture with higher mechanization and labor productivity can still remain as an important sector for employment and livelihoods for countries like Uzbekistan. So that's question number one. And the second question, and I think this has to do more to do with the legacy of the Soviet Union. You know, with planned economies, you have a huge number of people employed in the public sector. So keeping records, bureaucracy, you know. So, and public sector usually was accounted for a large share of employment. So how would you account public sector, the share of the public sector in the models you listed in the beginning? And it may not, the service sector cannot account public sector very much, or does it account for the public sector fairly? What do you think of it? And that's it. So please feel free. Yeah, 5 minutes to answer all these questions.
No, this has been a wonderful opportunity for us to put the issues on the table, and I appreciate Nadir's slides. In fact, it really complemented very well the slides that I was presenting. So it's should be considered as a kind of a joint presentation between Nadir and I on this topic. But more importantly, before I answer this question, this work is done by a colleague from India, Dr. Balaji, and I'm not sure he joined us. I sent this invitation probably to him. He has been looking at the data sets in India for quite some time, and it was revealing that the data itself has been changing in Indian context. India has been collecting data for agriculture sector for a long time, okay? Even there, you see the inconsistencies in the data, and as more data comes in, the results change and so on. So we are continuing to explore that aspect of, you know, availability of data and the how do you classify the data according to the various sectors, and these classifications can also distort your results and in terms of policy implications, right? So this is something that we need to keep in mind as we explore Central Asian data as well. It is in line with what Nadir said. But let me answer the second question first. I mean, usually people kind of clump the public sector into the services sector, and there is not clear distinction. And given that classical post-Soviet conditions in terms of high level of public sector, and I knew that. I mean, I firsthand saw that in the early 90s in Central Asia. I mean, you just don't worry about the wage, you know, just have a title and a job in any public sector, you know, and then that becomes what we call this disguised employment, that so to speak, right, that we talked about. We talked about that in the agriculture sector in terms of Lewis's model. Here we are talking about, if you put public sector in the services sector, you are talking about disguised employment in services sector. So the analysis has to be different here, right? Because the structure to start with is different. So all the same, it all boils down to how many people are really employed and in the sector, and how they are employed, and what is their contribution. How do you measure their productivity, right? And that becomes an important question for the post-Soviet countries, particularly. It's a special kind of challenge, right? And that's where it becomes exciting for economists to work on those kind of issues. So from that perspective, it is an absolutely wonderful area to explore for a graduate student, or even to take that as a serious research program, to think about, how do we understand the contribution of disguised employment in the public sector. And you can go also into that subsectors. Okay, take research, for example. If you look at the agriculture research system, you will see a lot of professors, so-called academician, I'm just giving an example, who are probably on the payroll, or who are still working, but they may not be actually doing research, for example, contribution. I don't know, I'm just giving an example. So this is something that we need to think about, right? So coming to this first question of agriculture still remains a valid primary driver of economic growth in Africa. So you saw the Tanzanian case of what happens, agricultural the structural transformation itself contributing huge amount to economic growth. That is still going to be the case for long time to come. That's why there is still programs for Green Revolution for Africa, and you are still working on the agriculture sector, because a large number of poor are still in rural areas. And productivity increases in rural areas, rural agricultural sector is going to make a huge difference for them in terms of poverty reduction and welfare and their expenditure pattern and access to services like education and health, which has to have their own personal transformation in a generation to come. Without that, the rural economy will be stagnant, and you will never have the productivity going up there and the release of labor from that economy, rural economy to manufacturing and services sector. So in almost all, although I should say, mechanization has come in, because labor is, the agriculture is laborious, and labor particularly find it difficult to cover a large area. In Africa, for the most part, although land scarcity is increasing, for the most part, you still have a large, extensive farming that is going on. The land is abundant. So that means, if you want to increase the production, even with the productivity yield levels that we have, you need to resort to mechanization. That has implication, of course, for labor productivity, of course, for labor transfer to other sectors like manufacturing and services. That needs to be studied, and I think our colleagues at IFPRI have started to study that as well. So that's a good question, actually, by the way, whoever asked that question. It's a fantastic question. Let me stop here and once again thank my colleague, Dr. Balaji from India, who worked on it, and thank the organizers as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think your co-author, Dr. Balaji, is online with us. So I saw his name. So thank you very much, Suresh. One more time, thank you, Nadir Janibeka, for your interesting discussion of the presentation. So I would like to thank our viewers for allowing us to go over time. Please join us next Wednesday. We'll have another speaker from IFPRI, Hiroyuki Takeshima, discussing the agriculture nutrition linkages with using evidence from Tajikistan. So with that, I'd like to thank our organizers, IFPRI, Kamjan Akramov, Nader Janibek from YAMO, and Ahtam Hussaina from Westminster with helping with logistics here. So thanks very much, and stay safe and healthy. See you next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.